College football is back. In a couple of days, we're going to have college football back on our TVs because week 0 is here. And I know that week 1 is when we start getting into the meat of things, and week 0 is just a little bit of that appetizer. But we actually have a pretty solid game to talk about for week 0 with the Florida State Seminoles and the Georgia Tech Yellow Jackets in an ACC showdown. And when you look at the last 2 years during week 0, the marquee game was kind of a mixed bag. Notre Dame Navy was in 2023 in Ireland, and that game wasn't really that good because Notre Dame was much better than Navy. And then in 2022, you had that epic game between Northwestern and Nebraska where Scott Frost completely blew the game by going for that onside kick against Northwestern. That was absolutely a terrible decision. That happened right when I started my YouTube channel as well. So for me, it was just such a memorable moment in college football, and it was absolutely hilarious watching that game. But now this year, we have a game where it looks like it should be an easy game to pick, with Florida State being given a 77% chance to win this game, according to the ESPN FBI predictor. And when you look at the betting odds, Florida State is favored by over 10 points, but I would not go as far as to say that this is an easy game for Florida State, because not only is it the first game of the year, which is always tough because you never know how a team is going to look right out of the gate. Sometimes it takes a team 3 or 4 weeks into the season to finally get things going. But also Georgia Tech, they were a better team last year. They are improving under Brent Key. And even though Mike Norvell has been at Florida State longer than Brent Key's been at Georgia Tech, and Florida State has a much more talented roster than the Yellow Jackets, Florida State lost a lot of great players from last year's team. They have a new quarterback, and they're having to replace a lot of guys from last year's team. And I don't think Florida State's going to be as good this year. Whereas Georgia Tech, they are returning a lot of players from last year's team, and they have their starting quarterback in Haynes King returning from this past season. And I think that Georgia Tech might be a decent team in the ACC this season. So I'm going to go over who I believe is going to win this game between Florida State and Georgia Tech, and I'm going to give my quick predictions on the other games during week 0 as well. Now, when you look at Florida State, they're ranked in the top 25 to start the year at number 10, and I think that is absolutely fair because the way Florida State played last year, they were a fantastic team, and they should have made the college football playoff if it wasn't for Jordan Travis's injury, but it is what it is. I understand why the college football playoff committee left them out, because they would have gotten annihilated in the playoff, but still, to leave out an undefeated Power 5 champion, it's absolutely ridiculous. Florida State should have made the college football playoff, but still, I understand why they were left out. But now they do not have those same players from last year's team. They're losing a ton of guys. When you look at the quarterback position and the fact that DJ Uiagalelei is going to be the starting quarterback for the Seminoles next season, replacing Jordan Travis, and Uiagalelei is one of the more polarizing quarterbacks in college football because some people think that he still has a lot of potential and that he could be a guy that can be an NFL quarterback, but other people just don't like him as a QB. They don't think he's a good player, dating all the way back to his Clemson days. And when he was at Oregon State, he did better under Jonathan Smith, but still some people thought that it wasn't good enough. But Florida State is going to be a weak conference in the ACC overall. It's not like DJ is going to be going up against SEC opponents and Big Ten opponents, so it should be easier for DJ, but still, a lot of people are not high on him. But he is going to have Roydell Williams beside him, the transfer running back from Alabama. That's a massive addition for Florida State. He's a guy that has a lot of talent. I think he could be one of the most important pieces for Florida State's offense next season, and if he has a good year, we'll definitely take the pressure off of DJ. Then the wide receiver room, you got Malik Benson and Jalen Brown, who are both transfers. I will say that Florida State has done a fantastic job bringing in transfers the past couple years under Mike Norvell. Getting a guy like Keon Coleman last year, and then also on defense, Tatum Bethune was a huge player for them. Just several players that made a big difference for their program on both sides of the ball, and that should continue this season for Florida State. Overall, I like what Florida State has done with their roster. I think a lot of people are sleeping a bit on the Noles, thinking they're going to backslide very hard this year, but they do have a lot of talented players coming coming into the program yet again, and they should at least be an 8-4 or 9-3 team or better, especially since the ACC isn't too tough. But Georgia Tech is not a slouch, because when you look at the players that they have returning and some of the players that they have brought in, their roster is solid. Haynes King is a guy that's just gotten better and better every single season. He's starting to cut back on his mistakes. He does need to improve on turnovers, but I do think that potentially he could have his best season yet this year. Then you got Jamal Haynes at running back, and then Chase Lane at wide receiver, and Eric Singleton and Malik Rutherford. And the key is all these guys are back. Outside of a transfer for their offensive line, Georgia Tech's offense is completely the same from this past season, and they had a decent offense this past year. It's not like they were a bad offense in 2023. It should only get better in 2024. They added a couple of guys for their defense through the portal, but like I said, most of their team is intact from this past year, and that is tough to do in college football these days with the amount of players that enter the portal or go off to the pros. So Georgia Tech, definitely that continuity is going to help. And then when you look at the all-time series between Florida State and Georgia Tech, it's a competitive series. Even though Florida State did dominate the series in the 90s and 2000s, Georgia Tech did knock off Florida State 2 times in a row back in 2015 and 2020, but then Florida State got the best of them in 2022 and Brent Key's first season as the Yellow Jackets head coach, and that's when Florida State started to hit their stride. But like I said, Georgia Tech's better now than they were then, and Florida State could be a little bit worse now than they were then, which is why I think this could be a close game, and the fact that it's a week 0 game. Teams never play up to their potential in week 0. Look at that Georgia-Clemson game a couple years ago in week 1. Georgia barely beat Clemson, and then Georgia ended up going on to win the national championship. So they were nowhere near as good as they ended up being that season in week 1. That's why I think this is going to be a pretty close game. And I asked people on Twitter who they think is going to win this game, and 75% of people went with Florida State, and 25% of people went with Georgia Tech. So it's about the same as the betting odds. Kind of makes sense. I understand why Florida State is still a pretty hefty favorite in this game, but I do think the game could be even closer than most people are expecting, and it's probably a good chance that Georgia Tech will end up covering in this game. But what is my final prediction for this game between Florida State and Georgia Tech? I believe it's going to come down to the wire. I don't think it's going to be a blowout game. We have seen blowouts in week 0 and in week 1 before, but it usually is because one team ends up playing really poorly and the other team just maybe did a little bit better than expected. But Georgia Tech's not a team that I believe is going to get blown out, especially this early in the season. Brent Key has the program going in the right direction. He retained most of his players. They're going to be fired up for this game. And this game is in Dublin, Ireland. Have to put an emphasis on that. So it's not at Florida State or Georgia Tech. It's a neutral site game. There's going to be fans from both teams at this game, even though it probably will lean Florida State by a hair with the crowd. I think that DJ Uiagalelei might have a little bit of rust in his first game for Florida State, trying to learn a new scheme, trying to learn to play around new players, kind of like he did at Oregon State. Georgia Tech has that continuity advantage, so that's definitely going to help out the Yellow Jackets. But Mike Norvell, I think he's proven that he's a good enough coach, and he's got a good enough team with too much talent overall across the board that I do believe that Florida State at the end of the day will knock off Georgia Tech in Dublin, Ireland by a score of 24-17. But the Yellow Jackets, they're going to end up covering this game, and I feel like it could be a potential thriller to start off the college football season the right way. And then when you look at the other week 0 games, nothing too special. You got Montana State and New Mexico. Bronco Mendenhall in his first game as the New Mexico head coach, but the betting odds are not high on New Mexico. They have Montana State favored by 11.5. Even though the game's at the Lobos, I guess that Montana State's going to pull off the win against New Mexico. I feel like Bronco Mendenhall might turn around the Lobos, but New Mexico has been an awful team the past few years, so it's going to take some time. SMU's a hefty favorite over Nevada. I believe that the Mustangs, with their first game as an official ACC member, is going to get the win over Nevada, especially now that Nevada is nowhere near at the level they were when they had Carson Strong at quarterback. And then you got Delaware State and Hawaii. Hawaii has not been a good team the past few years. They're nowhere near where they were when they had Cole McDonald at quarterback and some of the other good quarterbacks that they've had in the past. But Delaware State's not a good team, so Hawaii should be able to win this game. But that wraps up the week 0 games, and I think that even though it's a light slate, it's always just great when college football is back. It's the little appetizer we get before a fantastic week week 1, where we got a lot of great games that I will be previewing and predicting next week. Can't wait to start getting back into the college football season. It's going to be a whole lot of fun, and we're going to be on this journey together as we go week by week, predicting who's going to end up winning these massive games in college football as we go on our way toward the first season of the 12-team college football playoff and all these new teams being in these new conferences. And it all starts in week 0 with this Dublin Ireland showdown between Florida State and Georgia Tech. But let me know what you guys think in the comment section down below, whether you think that Florida State's going to get upset by the Yellow Jackets and to start off the college football season in a crazy way, with Georgia Tech getting a huge win over the Florida State Seminoles, or whether you believe Florida State will take care of business, and what your predictions are for the other week 0 games. Subscribe to the channel if you like sports content. Like this video down below. Follow me on Twitter as well. Link is in the description, and I'll see you next time.